Here is a purple ink by Sailor, Studio 453. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. A very blue-leaning purple that, if you aren't careful in your paper choice, you might think of it as a blue. There is a predictable amount of tone variation by pen, but not so much that you might think it's a different ink, so it's fairly predictable. There is some shading, but I don't see shading as a standout feature of this ink. I would say it is there. So I cannot say this is my favorite purple, not in the least, but I did really enjoy using it and can see a bunch of people really liking this ink. The pen for today is a Sailor Riello. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we see the lightest tone that is definitely not too light to be able to be used. It's really dark enough. It's a very nice paler purple here. No feathering, no spread. Quickly looking at it, you do see that there's some shading. Looking at quickly on the second line, the Q starts darker. It lightens up into the U, I, C, starts to get darker, and the K, L, Y, much darker than the rest of the word. So it is shading fairly decently. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a bit darker than it was with the extra fine, with no feathering, with no spread, being very much a true blue here. Really, a true blue, a true purple. And not seeing any kind of blue undertones that I did talk about at the very beginning. No feather, no spread. It does shade rather comfortably, looking at comfortably on the first line. The C starts darker, same with the O. The M lightens up quite a bit. The F, O, R are darker, but the T is even darker than that, lightening up just a little bit on the A, B, and the L, Y is quite a bit darker. So it does that quite a bit in a lot of the words, so it shades fairly well, though the shading in and out is very gentle in how it does it. No standout kind of way. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do, in looking at it, see the blue undertones really kind of coming through here a lot. And it's magic in what's happening, the kind of thing that Gandalf and Thorin would discuss. Looking at Gandalf and Thorin on the second line, you see very, very dark areas, very purple without a doubt. So the G in Gandalf at the top, very dark, lightens up, stays purple into the D where it gets very dark again. The A lightens up and starts to really show some of those blue undertones. Now, while the LF do darken up a bit, they still show some of the blue undertones coming through. And in between them, starts lighter, gets darker at the downstroke of the D. And both the N and D are showing the purple and bluish tones at the same time. Now, Thorin starts as a nice mid-tone with the TH, lightens up during the H into the OR. The R starts transitioning into a much darker tone, the I lightening up again, and the N becoming very dark, all showing purples and blues. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. The shading sticks out better than it did on the Clairfontaine. It really does when you see it on sat. The T much darker, with goes lighter to darker, stuck on the third line, goes lighter on the S, starts to darken up, gets very dark at the K. Far, the top and very bottom of the F are a bit darker. Most of the F is lighter. Midtone at the A, lighter again at the R. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, a little bit lighter than on the Clairfontaine, flatter as well, also showing a lot more of the blue undertones coming through. No feather, no spread. Take a look at he on the second line. First word, it starts kind of as a blue and transitions into a purple as it would be shading. So the shading is more like a shifting from purple to blue to purple, like had on the second line. The H is purple. The A into the D looks a bit blue. The up and down stroke of the D, purple. Probably a very interesting effect if people would want to see it on probably with the third line. You see a lot of that shifting back and forth, blue to purple, though both of them just as dark. I'm hoping the camera lets it come through. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering and there is no spread. There is some shading, and not just of convenience. It does it in a rather wonderful way. Look at convenience on the second line. The C is darker. It works its way lighter to the V. During the V, it gets very dark and then lightens up its way out again through most of the word until the I starts to get darker, lightens up again, the E much darker. Wonderful indeed, like wonderful on the third line. That starts as a nice mid-tone. The D gets darker. And the strange thing about that darker D is it looks blue. It lightens up out of that into a kind of purple till you get to the F, darker and more blue looking. The U, lighter and purple. But the L is dark and purple. There's a really interesting effect going on here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, but it is blue as a result of this paper. The papers sometimes and quite frequently shows a color shift the ink might go through for that. As a blue, there is no feathering and there is no spread. I have not forgotten about shading. Looking at forgotten on the second line, the F starts darker. It lightens up just a hair for the O-R-G-O-T, but the T-E-N at the end is a bit darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than on the Clairfontaine. Still very much being a blue instead of a purple, with no feathering and with no spread. It's got rather smooth shading that's going on. Take a look at smoothed on the first line. You see it starts lighter, and it ever so slightly lightens just a little bit more at the O-O-T, and at the head at the end, it starts to darken up a little bit and a lot at the D. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, darker than on the Clairfontaine. It shows a lot of the blue. It also shows some of the purple here in its darker areas. So yeah, it's going to shade. There's no feathering and there is no spread. There is shading, gathering its forces on one side. Look at gathering on the first line. The G is darker, the A is lighter. At the lighter A into the T, it's kind of a blue. But when it gets dark at the top of the T or into the H, becomes a bit more purple. The ERIN, lighter and blue, where the G is darker and purple. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread. There is some homely shading going on. Look at homely on the second line. It's not really homely. Kind of nice, but homely starts darker, lightens up at the OME, darkens up a whole lot at the LY at the end. Left on the first line, I'm really pointing out because of the vertical lines. You see the vertical lines of this quad rule do cut the ink a little bit, really breaks up some of the writing, and for me is a little distracting. So, as is the case with many inks, the quad rule is not the friendliest to this ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is shading. Look at table, middle of the second line. You see that the bottom of the T is much darker than the top of the T. And even the A, the very top where it turns down into the stroke, that moment at the top is darker. The A mostly is lighter, going into the B that becomes darker at the top, but the bottom loop much lighter, and then darkening up through the LE. Continuing to look at table and those vertical lines, we see that the lines on the paper are breaking up the ink. Again, just a bit distracting for me. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium. It is lighter, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread. The shading has its own voice. Look at voice on the first line. For the most part, we see a really uniform tone. The end of the V into the O is quite a bit darker. The I is darker than the O or C next to it. The E is quite a bit darker. Told, right next to that, starts lighter, works its way darker through the word. It is shading. I think it's shading just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. We're still seeing some breakup of the ink on some of the vertical and horizontal lines. It's more the vertical lines where it really stands out and, again, is distracting for me. Looking at the back of the page, there is no bleeding and there is no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman, their number 13. Here is Diamine Scribble Purple. Here is Papier Plume Violet. Here is Sailor Kobe number 18. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Also, a bit more blue leaning. It's like a blue leaning purple here. It didn't lose being purple. It didn't have any feathering and it didn't have any spread. It does have shading. Now, with it being a little lighter and this paper, I think it's shading a little bit nicer than it did on the Clairfontaine. Not necessarily more, probably the same amount, but I think it's nicer and it's easier to see. Look at South on the first line. The S is a nice mid-tone. It lightens up through the middle of the word, and on a TH, it starts getting much darker. Does the same thing with North on the second line. It does it with Them on the third line. Starts lighter on the T, a very dark He in the middle, lighter M on the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading. Looking at Mirkwood, first word, first line. The M starts darker and works its way lighter. It gets quite a bit lighter into the IR, and the K very dark, and then works its way lighter again into the woo, but at the D starts getting quite a bit darker. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, lighter than on the Clairfontaine. I think we're seeing it more still purple leaning blue. We see some of the blues, we see some of the purples. The darker tones that you're going to get definitely look blue. The lighter tones definitely look purple. So it's funny because to me it's backwards from what I would have thought. I would have thought the darker tones would have looked more blue, but look at it on the first line. Very dark, very blue. Mountains on the first line starts darker. When it gets lighter at the end, becomes more purple. The T, darker, blue. A-I-N, lighter and purple. S, darker and blue. So it shades well, but it shades blue and purple. Kind of neat if that's what you want. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there is no bleeding and no ghosting, making this a good ink for students.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is a green ink by Caran-d'Ache Delicate Green.
Here is a gray shimmering ink by Pelikan Edelstein Moonstone.
Here is a pink ink by Krishna Bohemia. Here is a yellow ink by Diamine Golden Sands. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, this is definitely a blue and not a purple. Looking at it, my eye, I hope it comes through the same on camera. There is feathering and there is spread. Neither the feathering or the spread are something that are a major concern considering it's 20-pound toilet paper. No real shading going on. I think you could use this if you wanted to. I feel like you would be wasting a very good ink though. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Funny story, just as dark as it was with the extra fine, I think it's showing a bit more purple. Look at silver. The whole bottom of silver really does look purple. It's the L that starts to look blue. Yes, this feathers. Yes, this spreads. Yes, this is 20-pound toilet paper. You can't have the highest expectations. There are a couple moments of shading that do occur, like the L in silver or the G in gold, but not really very much. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, a little bit darker, I think, than it was on the Clairfontaine. Mostly looking blue with feathering, with spread. There's a lot. I mean, look at things on the first line. The amount of feathering going on there makes it kind of thingy, wouldn't you say? No real shading. So it's really just there. And again, kind of a waste of a good ink on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, as far as ghosting, actually, this is not horrible, but I would not write back here because you see the ink does get very deep into the paper. None of it bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine is a lighter purple with the tiniest hint of shading, though it stays looking purple. The medium is a bit darker, but also starts to look much more like a blue leaning, and it shades more. The stub is darker again and shades more, and here it can be hard to say if this is a blue-leaning purple or a purple-leaning blue. Now, for me, the medium being a for sure purple and having decent shading makes it the right nib for me. That medium flow, medium nib.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.